I wanted to be a photographer since the day my dad gave me a camera. And my dad was really against, he was very adamant about me not being a photographer because he thought that meant doing wedding portraits and baby pictures in a little studio somewhere. And of course, I had this fantasy of working for Time or National Geographic. And my father said, you have a D- average, you never complete anything. And this idea that you're just going to go out and be a photographer is so incredibly unrealistic. You need to work, if you wanted to work for a magazine like that, you'd have to spend 30 or 40 years, getting your craft right, and then maybe you'd be lucky enough. So I went to a college with no photography program, thanks to my father. I immediately went to my art professor and worked out with him to create my own major, which was photography. I did the newspaper, the yearbook, and the year I graduated, I went up to Time magazine with my yearbook under my arm, and I still don't know how this happened, but I got hired by Time magazine at like 23. And it was a complete fantasy. I mean, I was meeting presidents and prime ministers, I was renting Learjets, I was hanging out. I mean, I would pinch myself every day and think this was some drug-induced hallucination. I was still back in the dorm. One of the early assignments that I got was they sent me to Australia to do a cover story on Aborigines, and which is incredible because I'd never been to Australia before. I flew into the Outback, this little town of Alice Springs, and the writer had already written the story. My job was to go out and find pictures to illustrate his story. And he had worked with a social worker, this very nice woman named Jenny. And she said, when you check in your hotel, make a right out of the hotel, walk down the street 2 blocks to a pub, and I'll meet you in the pub, and then we'll go into the Aboriginal camps. I'll introduce you to the tribal elders, get your permission. So I walked out of my hotel, and of course, instead of making a right, I made a left, which is typical of me. I looked up the street, and the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen in my life was washing the windows of my hotel. This was the cover story that I was shooting. And I took a picture of this woman, and she got really upset and told me what I could do with my cameras in no uncertain terms. And I went over to apologize, and she said, were you some kind of journalistic parasite here to photograph our Aborigines? I said, I am a journalist. I'm not a parasite. There was no way I could calm her down, so I apologized, and I made a trip down the street instead of up the street, met Jenny. We worked in the camps all day, and at the end of the day, Jenny said, what are you doing for dinner tonight? And I said, I'm going to go back to my hotel room and label my little rolls of film. That's back in the old days we used film. And she said, well, a group of us that work with Aborigines are getting together for dinner at a friend's house on the outside of town. You might want to come and meet some of the other social workers, people involved in the Aboriginal rights movement. So she gave me the directions. I drove to what I thought were the directions, and I ended up in this abandoned-looking building with the roof caving in, the walls. And I thought, okay, I've done it again, but I figured I'm already out here. So I walked over and timidly knocked on the door, and of course, who answers the door but the woman who had been washing the windows of my hotel, who was not at all pleased to see me again. She said, what the hell are you doing here? And I said, Jenny invited me for dinner. And she said, well, put your cameras down. You can't photograph my friends. I said, fine. So I put the cameras down, and I walk in the backyard of her house, she has 4 camels tied up. And I said, why do you have camels? And she said, it's none of your business. So I went to Jenny and said, what's with your friend? I didn't, kill her dog or anything. I just took a picture of her. So she said, Robyn's quite lovely once you get to know her. And I said, well, that's not going to happen anytime soon. But why does she have camels? And she said, Robyn is this odd girl that showed up here about a year ago. We don't know who she is. She showed up here with $6 in her pocket. We bring her food. She found this abandoned house to live in. And she's got this crazy idea that she's going to walk 2,000 miles from Alice Springs, the center of Australia, through the Gibson Desert, out to the Indian Ocean. And I said, why? She said, we don't know. We're worried she's going to die out there. We all told her we want to go with her. She won't let anybody come with her. I said, wow, that's really incredible. So at the end of the week, after working all week during, it's a small town, so you run into a lot of the same people. Jenny says, I was thanking Jenny. I was about to leave the next morning, and she said, I have sort of an awkward thing to ask you. And I said, what? And she goes, remember Robyn? I said, yeah, she's a little hard to forget. She said, well, she wants to ask you a favor, but she's a little embarrassed because she hasn't been very nice to you. And I was trying to imagine, what could the favor possibly be? And she said, Robyn wrote to National Geographic a year ago and asked them for funding, and they never answered. And she thought maybe you might know somebody there. She could use your name, as a sort of a reference. And I said, well, I've been to workshops. I've met a few of the editors. I don't know that my name would carry any weight, but tell her, sure, she can use my name. I thought that would be the end of it. So I went back to the United States. I was home about a week, and my phone rings. It's the editor of National Geographic. I'm like, whoa, this is like really cool. And I said, hi. And he says, listen, we're calling because we got this letter from this very interesting woman in Australia telling us about this journey she's going to make, and we're really intrigued, and we're thinking about funding it, but is she a nutcase? Is she for real? Is she going to die out there? We don't want the headline, National Geographic Explorer dies in week 2, And I said, well, she's very intense. She's very focused. I've seen her camels and her maps, and she's fiercely focused on this trip. And he said, well, since you guys are such good friends, would you like to be the photographer that's going to have to find her 5 times during the next months during her trip? So I embarked, and of course my friend said, you're the one that's going to die out there. I mean, I couldn't even change the tire on my car. I was a New York City kid, This is, how people start looking like their dogs. Robyn was one of the most interesting human beings I've ever met, and one of the reasons is that most of us spend our lives avoiding the things that frighten us, and Robyn had this strange attraction, not in a suicidal way, but she believes that most people spend their lives using the things that frighten them as the negative center of gravity, so they're always doing this and going around that thing, and she feels that most of us are like self-defeating, and so she's always challenging herself and her friends and everybody else around her, including me, as I came to learn on the trip. This is her father, who came out to see her off. I think this quote from Tom Robbins is very, very accurate because there's a very fine margin between suicide and adventure, and I think the closer you get to the danger, the more sort of alive some people feel in this sort of environment. She had a wonderful dog named Digitty, who was the first dog I've ever fallen in love with, and she was very resentful that Digitty liked me. She wanted Digitty to hate me, But I adored Digitty, and I asked her one day where Digitty came from, how she got Digitty, and I was like, backstories. And she said that 2 years before she moved to Alice Springs, she was working as a janitor in a hospital in Brisbane and just emptying out trash bins. And one night she heard these terrible cries coming from the basement of the hospital. And it was late at night. There was only one other janitor there. And she went downstairs and found a room where they were taking stray dogs and experimenting on them. And she said she couldn't stand it. And she waited till the other janitor left. She went downstairs, opened all the doors, all the cages, let all the animals out. Got fired the next day, but this little puppy that had been brought in that morning that nothing had been done to, thank God, wouldn't run away, and that became Digitty. And Digitty protected her so many times. I've never seen a love affair like this between, a lot of you have dogs, and I have 2 dogs of my own now, but this was like her daughters. Digitty slept in the sleeping bag with her, warned her if there were snakes, took her back to where she'd camped if they got lost. Just amazing. She walked 20 miles a day. And if she walked 20 miles a day, Digitty ran 40 miles a day because Digitty would scamper all around. I would fly out and find Robyn and spend a week or 2 with her at a time. And as a New York City kid, I thought the Outback was really ugly at the beginning. I thought it was this ugly background to this exotic-looking woman. But as the trip went on, you'll see in the pictures later on, I started seeing it through her eyes. I couldn't figure out why she kept saying it was so beautiful, and then I slowly started seeing it. This is Ayers Rock. It's the largest rock in the world. It's 5 miles around, and I'm going to try to use the laser pointer here. You see that little cave right there? That's a little round thing. This is what's inside there. And it's just massive, and people climb the rock now. When it rains, and it only rains maybe every 15 years, brine shrimp hatch on top of Ayers Rock. So you're in the middle of the desert, and this is once the bottom of the ocean. It's so cool. Like, can you imagine shrimp hatching in the middle of the desert? Robyn, you would think she must have grown up on a cattle station, that she was like one of these Outback hardy, souls. But in fact, she had never done anything like this. She was basically as clueless as I was before I went, except she'd spent 2 years getting ready, and I was out there with my 4-wheel drive, Toyota Land Cruiser. She would lift and load and unload almost 300 pounds of gear every morning and every night. Extraordinary. I would fly out there, and we'd have, these are flies, by the way, on her arm. And the flies out there were absolutely fierce. I would show up out there, and every time I would show up, having a conversation with Robyn was like having somebody continually poking you. She did this to herself, she did it to her friends, but she also did it to me a lot. And I remember one of the first times I went out there, she said, Americans treat friendship like Valium. It was like the insult of the day. And I said, okay, what is that supposed to mean? And she said, every time I see Americans together, you're always saying, don't worry, it'll be fine, it'll all work out. And I said, that's a bad thing, because she said, in Australia, if you care about somebody, if you really care about them and they're doing something stupid, if they're marrying the wrong person and they have an abusive boss, they're doing drugs, whatever it is, you risk your friendship by hitting them over the head with a 2x4. Like you're brutally honest with your friends because you care about them. And she said, you guys all coddle each other like you're cowards. It's like, okay. This was like every day we had conversations like this. It was so interesting, and I didn't always agree with her, but she always made me think in a way that I'd never thought about things before. I was terrified every time I left her that she was going to die out there. I always thought, every time I drove away, I'd look in the rear view mirror of my car and wonder if that would be my last memory of her. I was a fledgling photographer. I was just getting started, but I was so fascinated by this woman and mesmerized by the Australian outback and by this strange quixotic-like trip that she was on. She would sit by the campfire at night with a little cassette player you can see in the background there and learn to speak the local Aboriginal languages. She wanted to learn not about them but from them. She wanted to spend time with them. One time when I came out, and she would be alone for weeks and weeks at a time. One time I came out and I sat down, we were talking, and she said, "When are you going to get here?" I said, "What?" And she said, "When are you going to get here?" And I thought, oh my God, she's actually gone nuts, And I said, "I'm sitting right in front of you." And she said, "No, you're not." She said, "Since the moment you got here, you've been talking about, did your pictures get on the cover of Time magazine from the Taiwan cover story, where you're leaving the car in 3 weeks?" She said, "You get out here and you say you want to spend time here with me, and then you're everywhere else except here." And you think about today when you walk in a restaurant and you see couples doing this, and they're with everybody else except the person they're actually sitting with. This is back in a time with no GPS, no satellites, no cell phones, no way for her to call for help, no way to be found, completely off the grid. It would almost be illegal to do what she did back then today. She adored these camels. They were like 2,000-pound dogs. They'd sleep next to her at night. They would nuzzle her. They would try to steal her food. Every one of these stories, every one of these pictures I can tell you stories about. She had a dream early on in the trip about an old Aboriginal man, and in the dream, the Aboriginal man traveled with her. And once I came out, I think the fourth trip, and there was this little Aboriginal man named Mr. Eddie. And Mr. Eddie took her, she had met him. There was an area that she was not allowed to go into because no women were allowed to go through this sort of sacred area. And he decided he was going to walk with her for 6 weeks. Extraordinary gentleman. That when she would show up in these villages, the Aborigines, first of all, the Aborigines really appreciated that she was trying to spend time with them and learn from them, because so many people came out there as tourists snapping pictures out the windows of their car. It was very odd to think that I shot these pictures and couldn't see them. I mean, literally, you would ship your film back to Washington completely sight unseen and never get to see whether your pictures had even come out. This is a little newsletter that some of the Aboriginal kids wrote. Imagine living in a little outback community and just seeing planes flying over and wonder who was in those little pieces of metal flying over you. Robyn didn't wear clothes a lot during the trip. I actually had to ask her to put clothes on because the Geographic wasn't going to use pictures of her swimming naked or running around naked all the time. But she just said, "Look, this is my trip. I didn't do this trip for the Geographic or for you, so you basically have to deal with the trip the way that I want to do it." This is Mr. Eddie, who she just absolutely adored. They had such a wonderful relationship. And this is actually a scene. I'm going to show you a couple scenes in the movie real quickly. These are witchetty grubs. So he taught her she took a lot of tinned goods with her and prepared foods that she could open up and distill, put water into. But he taught her how to find bush food that she could live on. These are called witchetty grubs, and they're inside these sort of roots of plants. And I tried it once. It was really gross. It was like she fried it, but it still tasted awful. As I said, I was really worried that she was going to die out there. One day I was in Hong Kong in between assignments, and I came down to breakfast, and the Time magazine reporter I was working with, who knew I was shooting Robyn in between other assignments, said, "You better sit down." And I said, "What's going on?" He said, "Just sit down." And he showed me the local newspaper, and it said, "Mysterious camel lady missing in Gibson Desert. Desperate search underway." And I had a heart attack. I just thought, oh my God, this has happened, the thing I was the most afraid of the whole time. I'm just jumping ahead here, but this is how beautiful it was out there. So I jumped on an airplane. I flew to Australia. When the plane stopped in Darwin for refueling, they brought all the local papers on, and it said all of my pictures were floor to ceiling. The National Geographic giving out my pictures to the newspapers. So my assumption is that she was dead, and that basically all the journalists were looking for her. I flew down there. I always had a vague idea of where she would be, and as long as I could find an Aboriginal mission or camp near her, I would just say, do you know where the camel lady is? And it never took me, not once, more than 24 hours to get to the Aboriginal, for them to take me to where she was. It turned out that a racing car driver had driven across Australia 2 weeks earlier, had broken a world's record of crossing the entire country in this big racing car with fat tires. She said in the middle of the night, she woke up one night, heard this car coming out of nowhere, screeched up, the guy hits on her. She tells him to piss off. He gets to Sydney, has a press conference, and one of the journalists said, what was the most memorable part of your journey as you broke the world's record? He said, I spent a romantic night in the moonlight with a naked camel lady. Completely fabricated this whole story, so she knows nothing about this. When I got out to this little town, there were 80 journalists in this town, and I thought we were all going to look for Robyn dead, and I ended up leading all of them to her. So before I could say a word, they were thrusting newspapers in her face with my pictures. I always worried throughout the trip that she wondered whether my loyalties were to my career or to the magazine or to her, and my loyalties were to her. But it took me a little while to calm her down because here are my pictures in all these newspapers. She was attacked by wild camels. She ran out of water. She got lost. Sometimes she said she'd come up to an intersection, and on the map it would show one road going to the right and a road going to the left. It would say, walk down this road 2 weeks and you'll get to a well, and there'd be 5 paths going off. And like, which path do you take? And if you take the wrong one, you walk 2 weeks and the well's not there because you're not actually on that road. It's amazing that she actually survived. She got to the ocean. It took her 9 months. It was 1,700 miles. It was just an extraordinarily exciting day to watch her sort of in the ocean with her camels. They'd never seen anything bigger than a puddle before, so they tried drinking the water, which is pretty amazing. Throughout the trip, I kept saying to Robyn, you need to keep a journal, because someday you're going to want to write a book about this. And she said, why do you have to turn everything into a product? Like, why can't you just experience things and not always be filtering it and recording it and documenting it like you're never there because you're always outside looking in at it? So when she called me and said she'd written a book, I was like, you're kidding me. Do you want my journals? And she said, no, I think I did a pretty good job. She said, but I want you to read it because I'm not very nice to you in it. So I read the book, and like at the beginning, I'm an asshole, and then I get better as the trip goes on. So I think I came out okay by the end of the book. The story caught the world's imagination. Her book, which her publisher printed 4,500 copies, went on to sell 1 million copies in 18 languages. It was the most stolen book in Australia the year that it came out. Over the years since Robyn did this trip, she and I have gotten calls from Hollywood saying, we're going to do a movie about Robyn's journey. Originally, Julia Roberts was going to play Robyn. Then it was Helen Hunt. Then it was Nicole Kidman. So it was sort of like crying wolf. By the time these guys called me 2 years ago, this guy calls. He said, I'm the producer of The King's Speech. We bought Robyn's story. We're going to do this movie. I said, I've had this conversation now like 8 times with people in your field. He said, no, we've actually cast the actors, we've got the money, we're doing it, and we want you to come to Australia and be on the set, which was incredibly exciting.